presentation that I have today is based on my book, The Long Road Home. If you have read it, some of the material will be familiar. And if you haven't read it, I hope that you get the chance to take a look at some point. So as always, it is best to begin at the beginning. So once upon a time, a few mistakes ago, I was living in a faraway land called Oregon. It's really quite a beautiful place. It's both breathtakingly beautiful and uniquely unforgiving. If you cross the state from the east to the west, it's like crossing these invisible thresholds that separate alien worlds from one another. There are also seething ideological tensions in the state that seem to mimic these discordant environments. So at the time, it was January of 2020, and back before any of us had heard of anything called COVID. And like many Americans, I was appalled at the way that the Trump administration had stretched the norms of democratic rule. And like many Black Americans, I was wholly unsurprised by the emboldened white supremacy of Trump supporters. And at the time, in January of 2020, I was sure that Trump was going to win a second term in office. Now, by this point, I had already decided to leave the US to return back to Canada after living for a decade in the United States. And someone from the University of Oregon's Museum of Cultural and Natural History reached out to me. The museum used a monthly pub talk featuring faculty from the university as a fundraiser. Would I be interested in presenting my research? And I told the program coordinator that my new work on Black Lives Matter was not ready yet, in part because I had had 2 small children and 6 weeks of unpaid parental leave. But I was moving back to Canada and I had a lot of feelings about it. So could I present on that instead? And she said, sure, whatever you want. So the title of my presentation that evening was something like Return Some Probably Incoherent Ideas About Race, Democracy, and Going Home Again. And to my great surprise, the audience in the room was totally captivated. And it occurred to me that maybe there was something more to say. So that talk became this article on the left, which was published in the Globe and Mail on June 6th, 2020. Just as the kinetic uprisings that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis spread like wildfire across the country and the continent and then around the world. And then that article became this book. Many drafts later, because you learn as you write, and writing is messy. And sometimes, like Neil Gaiman's character, Dream of the Endless, once said, the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. So that book and that article and that first presentation all begin with something my father said in those early days of 2020, as I was talking to him, lamenting the Trump presidency and the state of the world. He said, you know, Debra, your daughter was the first Thompson born in America since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years. And some days I think we came back too soon. And those words just struck me. I couldn't get them out of my head. So some backstory. My dad was born and spent most of his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It's a tiny town about 50 miles east of Detroit on the shores of Lake Erie. It and neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden were the last stops on the Underground Railroad. In 1850, the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the series of larger political compromises that were made between the southern enslaving states and the northern free states. The act required officials to arrest anyone suspected of being a runaway slave based on no evidence, and it penalized officials who did not comply. Any person who was found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was liable to 6 months imprisonment and $1,000 fine. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured a fugitive slave. And those who were suspected of being runaway slaves were not eligible for trial, nor could they testify on their own behalf to defend themselves against the accusation. So the result was the legalization of a national program of mass kidnapping across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act didn't extend to Canada. And so it was to Canada that thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. And that's who you see in the picture. So most of the people who escaped to Canada actually went back to the US at the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones who they had left behind, who were stolen from them, or who they had lost somewhere along the way. But generations of those who are descended from these Black American refugees from slavery still live in southwestern Ontario, including my dad's family. Because the communities were rural and poor and segregated, my kin have the most wonderful way of speaking. They have Southern accents inflected with Canadianisms. My dad says theater, and he pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same rhythms and metaphors and riddles that characterize barbershop talk in African-American communities and cultures. He says things like, you know, Debra, those politicians ain't got nothing but a nodding acquaintance with the truth. But he's also so Canadian, and his accent appears plainly in words like a boat and sorry. Dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He thought he heard someone talking about Virginia or Alabama once, but he's skeptical. Debra, he says, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and for how long they could do it. So many of our stories are ghost stories. How could they not be? African descended people in the Americas are connected by the horrors of what we call the Middle Passage. It's the route during the transatlantic slave trade when Africans were violently kidnapped from their traditional territories, commodified as objects, forcibly transported to the New World, and sold as property. And so the deep of the Atlantic Ocean, the goddess Yamaya's domain, also holds a place in our collective memory. There's blood in the water. It's the fathoms of the dead. When I decided to move to the US over a decade ago, I felt like the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the country they built, where they prayed and sweated and toiled and were tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold, and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport. The country where they died, the places they still haunt. They escaped, but I returned to lay claim to the humanity and the dignity that they were refused. I thought I was going home. And obviously I was quite wrong, but maybe not in the way that you think. So what I want to share with you today are these invisible, maybe even ghostly matters in this story about coming both back too soon and yet also too late, and the construction of those moments and those places that define our identities. We have trouble taking ghosts seriously in the social sciences and in political science in particular, which is the discipline that I'm trained in, because it means delving into worlds that we can't see and therefore can't easily be measured. But for people of African descent in the Americas, who must exist in the realms defined by what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlives of slavery, struggling against what the great late Richard Eiton called the racial violence of the duppy state, we must think carefully about how, as Toni Morrison wrote, invisible things are not necessarily not there. So I want to tell you some of the story of what it was like to be in the US, in the land of my ancestors, in a country that both was and was not mine, to be doubly unwanted as both a Black person and an immigrant, but there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege. But then to leave, to return back to this country, which I also love, even as I think all forms of nationalism are highly problematic. I want to acknowledge the unrepentant structural racism of American society while not negating the subversive, insidious racism of Canada. To relay my bewilderment and my awe at Black people's love and hope for America, their pride in their country, their dedication to making it better, even as it has more often than not refuse to love us back. More than anything, I want to share what it means to be in a place, to have ancestral ties to a place, to be haunted by the ghosts tethered to the land and the water, but to be not of that place. These are questions that I asked of myself and my audience during that first pub talk back in Oregon, just as I ask of myself and of you now, in the hope that we can try collectively to think through what it means to lay claim to a country, to believe in freedom dreams, to seek to belong, to fight for change, even if that change means we must abolish everything and start again. So let's start again. So Americans often think of their country as exceptional. It's one of the world's oldest democracies. It's the only remaining superpower, the birthplace of revolutionary freedom, the last line of defense in a world that is constantly threatened by dictators and demagogues. Most famously articulated by the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville in 1835 in his 2-volume study, Democracy in America, the idea of American exceptionalism is that American democracy is somehow unusual, extraordinary, or unparalleled. There's something dramatic, or maybe it's just dramatically individualistic, about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To me, it always seems so much more daring than Canada's motto of peace, order, and good governance. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires a willful ignorance about how American democracy has worked for those who were excluded from that 18th century formulation, excuse me, for those who were excluded from that 18th century formulation of we the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal that all men were created equal was scarred into the Declaration of Independence at the same time as nearly 20% of the population was held in bondage. So from the vantage point of African Americans who live in what the great sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called the Black life world, the US isn't exceptionally free or equal. In fact, American racism is all the more cunning, all the more tragic, and all the more ruinous precisely because it exists alongside, but also in direct contradiction with the American creed, the pervasiveness of the American dream, and the homogenizing power of American national identity. And for those of us who observe American history in the making from abroad, the United States is only exceptional in terms of how utterly, unforgivingly, uncompromisingly racist it is. So this idea of American racial exceptionalism is very powerful in Canada. American racism is understood as real and morally repulsive. And in comparative terms, Canadian racism is either presumed not to exist, or if it does exist, it is assumed to be less harmful, less depraved, and less entrenched than the racism in the United States. Now, there's a couple of reasons why Canadians think this way, but the most relevant is the way that America and its foundational ideals, beliefs, narratives, identities, obsessions, psychoses have influenced the formation of Canadian national identity. Throughout its history, we, at least in Anglophone Canada, have struggled to form our own identity. It's hard to share a border with the world's only superpower. We also share a language and media and pop culture and more. So for Canadians, the US is kind of like the mean girl in high school. The United States is our very own Regina George. We hate her, but we love her. And she's terrible, but sometimes she's not terrible to us, but she's frequently terrible to other people. But really, why won't she just pay attention to us? It hurts our feelings that she doesn't think we're cool. And so because there are a lot of cultural similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is defined at least in part by being not American. And this has ramifications for how we understand ourselves in racial terms. The logic goes something like this. Racism exists in the United States. Being Canadian is being not American. Therefore, there is no racism in Canada. Comparison is frequently and faithfully used in the service of Canadian deniability. It's our national pastime, much more than hockey, actually. It's an obsession that works to both simultaneously hide and yet enshrine the persistent racial inequalities that define nearly every socioeconomic indicator in Canadian society. And yet the cognitive dissonance required to be righteously indignant about anti-Black racism in the United States, but defensive when the perpetrators are us and not the them, is itself a specifically Canadian kind of racism. This denial is aided and abetted by the way that Canadian multiculturalism is part of our national ethos. And yet, no matter how multicultural we claim to be, there's one question that non-white people get asked on the regular. Where are you from? No. Where are you really from? For those whose presence in Canada has never been questioned, it might be hard to hear the presumption in the question's premise, the insinuation. Where are you really from? Because I can see you're not one of us. Where are you really from? Because you don't seem to fit in here. Where are you really from? Because I will stop you on the street and demand that you answer my question because I am white and you are not. And deep down, I believe you owe me your time, your benevolence, your attention, and your respect. Where are you really from? Because my curiosity is much more important than your comfort or your safety. Where are you really from? Because how long you've been here will tell me something about your place in this country. Where are you really from? Because you can't possibly be from here. For years, Black Canadian scholars have explored the absented presence of Blackness in Canada. The absented part describes the way that Black people in Canada are assumed not to exist, or if we do exist, to be recent arrivals to what has always been a white country. Catherine McKittrick, who's an amazing Black studies scholar at Queen's University, writes that Blackness in Canada is always unexpected, always surprising. Blackness is surprising, she writes, because it should not be here, was not here before, was always here, is only momentarily here, was always over there, beyond Canada, for example. This means then that Black people in Canada are also presumed surprises because they are not here and here simultaneously. So read this way, the question, where are you really from, is an attempt to address the shock and astonishment of seeing Blackness in a place where it is not supposed to be. But Blackness in Canada is not just absent, it's absented, it's a verb. To be absented rather than absent implicates the involvement of political processes that bring conditions into being. Our invisibility in national mythologies is neither a coincidence nor a mistake, but rather a purposeful crafting of a vision of the Canadian nation that renders Black people invisible. Now, the presence part of absented presence implicates the ways that narratives of Canadian identity depend on the existence of Black Canada, even as they erase it. The idea of Canada as the promised land, as the destination for fugitive slaves who followed the North Star, a safe haven from the tyranny of American racism, a contemporary multicultural paradise, the only successful multicultural experiment the world has ever known. These are fundamental, foundational parables of the Canadian imagination, and they depend on the historical presence of an allegorical Black Canada, but just not too many Black people, of course. And certainly not angry Black people or radical Black people or loud Black people or ungrateful Black people or Black people who remember the razing of Africville and Halifax and Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, or Black people who point out the ways that Canada tolerates Blackness only begrudgingly. This is part of the reason why a sense of real belonging for me was always elusive in Canada. The kind of belonging I always wanted in the country of my birth, I instead sought in the country that enslaved my ancestors. So many immigrants experience a kind of culture shock when they arrive in their new country. It's a different climate, maybe a different language, different norms, different customs. And obviously, this wasn't a problem for me moving from Canada to the United States, except that I underestimated the power of the narcissism of minor differences. So this is a Freudian theory that communities with adjoining territories and close relationships are especially likely to engage in feuds and mutual ridicule because they are hypersensitive to the minute details that actually differentiate them. Now, there's some differences between Canada and the US that everyone knows about, like ketchup chips exist here. We use Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit is truly a nonsensical measure of temperature. Nobody understands it. The way that every Canadian has said to an American friend, did you know that Ryan Reynolds is Canadian? Or that was filmed in Vancouver, actually. But it turned out that a lot of what I knew of America came straight out of American pop culture. And so when I moved to the US, I was surprised to learn a few things. Cheerleaders are real. Who knew? If you grew up in the 90s or early aughts like I did, you perhaps thought that New York City was only made up of white people. It's not. There are people of color there too. And yet Portlandia is surprisingly accurate. I lived in the United States for 10 years. I lived in Boston, the birthplace of revolutionary freedom. I lived in southeastern Ohio in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I lived in Chicago, the great Black metropolis, and Oregon, the Western frontier. I met amazing people. I taught amazing students, and it was actually an incredible time. But there were some parts of being a Canadian in America that I could never quite wrap my head around. These are the bills for my children's births. I had never heard the words pre-existing condition or copay before I moved to the US, and I had no idea what on earth a deductible could possibly mean in the context of health insurance. I got used to asking whether or not there would be guns in a household before we let my daughter go to anyone's birthday party. I never really understood how or why, but it was clear to me over 10 years living in the United States that deep down Americans believe in the American dream. They believe that their society is fundamentally a meritocracy, and if you work hard, you can be anything. But they also implicitly, deep down, believe the opposite is true. If you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are sick or destitute, you just must not have worked hard enough. But one of the most consequential differences between Canada and the US is the nature and manifestation of structural racism. We often think of people as being racist, behaving in racist ways or holding racist attitudes, slurs that are shouted on the streets. And that happens both there and here. But racism is not just a function of individual attitudes, and so we cannot eradicate it by changing hearts and minds. Racism is the social, legal, political, and economic distinctions that mark and maintain unequal entry and access points to privacy, property, protection, prosperity, and personhood. Racism has shaped the contours of every major social, political, and legal institution in the United States. Every single one. If you name me an American institution, I can tell you its racist history. From banking to real estate, to the location of highways and grocery stores, from the funding of K-12 education, the origins of the Second Amendment, and the lack of anything close to universal health care, racism has touched literally every facet of American society in ways that I didn't understand until I got there. But there's another side to this too. I was once doing a presentation like this at a university that I will not name in Canada, except it was Queen's. And after it finished, an older couple came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we didn't think you were Black until you mentioned it." And they meant it as a compliment, and it was so Canadian of them. There is, I think, a value in the exploration of Blackness, belonging, and the politics of race in Canada and the US, not just in contrast, but rather in relation to one another. Ideas and inspirations, people and profits, goods and grievances have crossed the border for centuries. So too, Black freedom dreams have never been bound by national borders. And while others have compared racism in the United States to explicit circumstances of legal apartheid, like in South Africa or Nazi Germany, The idea in Canada that racism happened somewhere else or happened a long time ago requires a kind of national ignorance, what the poet Dion Brand calls a stupefying innocence that itself is worthy of careful examination. Extreme cases have a lot to tell us, but so do unsuspecting ones, and Canadian peculiarities make for interesting politics. Black communities in Canada are both very old, predating Confederation by over a century, and kind of new, growing only exponentially in the mid to late 90s. The population is quite small at 3.5% of the national population, but significant in cities like Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Ottawa. We are the diaspora of the diaspora, so to speak. Both old and new Black communities are products of global collusions and imperial collisions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But we Black Canadians have neither the same level of political or cultural recognition as African Americans, nor the sheer magnitude of the millions that comprise the Black populations of the Caribbean and South America. We also have a unique kind of racial consciousness here, the result of multiple formulations of Blackness in Canada that are crisscrossed with nationality, ethnicity, generational status, language, class, religion, and more, but which are also shaped by convergences, frictions, translations, and intersections with shifting contours of Canadian society and life. Organizing and creating solidarity even within the Black community is difficult here, but also full of the potential that comes with the recognition of multiple, overlapping, authentically contradictory Black experiences. Blackness in Canada also exists within the crucible of Canadian exceptionalism. That is, Canada the exceptional, Canada the clearly not racist, Canada the good, Canada the white savior, Canada the successful multicultural experiment. The dismissiveness of the realities of racism is part of the appeal, because if we are the exception to global racial rule, then we have no need to examine our exceptionally Canadian racial rules. It's a distraction, obviously, because Canadian racism is shaped not just by that global history that gives it a familiar force and feeling, but also by those specificities that make it Canadian born and bred, just like me. And so it's an open question about how Canadian racism is shaped by Canadian democracy, Canadian political structures, Canadian liberalism, Canadian whiteness, Canadian politeness, Canadian public policy, Canadian political parties, Canadian political culture, Canadian popular culture, Canadian urban centers, Canadian regionalism, Canadian ruralism, Canadian media, Canadian peacekeeping, Canadian war making, Canadian bilingualism, Canadian settler colonialism, and the Canadian national inferiority complex. Moreover, structural racism doesn't necessarily manifest the same way in Canada as it does in the United States. Structural racism here is highly malleable. It is both purposeful exclusion and predatory inclusion. It is invisibility and hypervisibility. It is operationalized by differential effects of universalistic laws and policies, by the informalities and discretions built into systems of power, by hidden entry points and overly emphasized exit ramps, and by normalized patterns of behavior that are excused away because this is just the way things have always been done here, Debra. Structural racism is state action that deliberately limits movement, the accumulation of wealth or access to opportunities, and it is also when governments choose not to act and instead let racist systems remain undisturbed. It is selective interest, sustained indifference, and messages of personal choice that naturalize racial inequality as a consequence of individual failings. It is government protection and benefits that are hard to access or that are withdrawn without reason, and it is the co-optation of radical demands in order to make them more palatable, profitable, and marketable. The truth is, there's a lot we don't know about the nuances of Canadian anti-Blackness. It's hard to research that which is so consistently jettisoned into the realm of the unthinkable. I came back to Canada in July of 2020, and it was a moment. Some called it a racial reckoning, hearkened by death, substantiated through struggle, haunted by the conceptual space between what was imaginable and what was possible. We didn't know then what had come crashing into the public sphere, full of chaos and passion, fury and rapture, and later, sadly, but predictably, dilution and co-optation. Even now, years removed from the uprisings in the summer of 2020, there isn't a coherent narrative that can explain why it was the world stopped to protest, to grieve, to rage, to rebel, to mourn together. I started writing my book during that moment, when protests in Minneapolis and LA, New York and Toronto, Montreal and London seemed like they were a seismic disruption with the potential to catalyze, finally, an acknowledgement that white supremacy was born and bred in the global sphere, an understanding that racism can manifest in the realm of ideas and can move across the border as easily as the wind, and an appreciation that historical context and local circumstances do matter, but they are nevertheless inflected with lessons and lesions from elsewhere, a resurrection of the disruptive and fracturing, compounding and yet conflicting potential of diasporic solidarity. I don't think that reckoning is the right word for all that has happened between then and now. The idea of reckoning, not unlike reconciliation, is about honored promises, debts repaid, and a balance restored. To reckon can also be used to express dreams and expectations, just as readily as a reckoning also faces the past again and again, kind of like the way of return involves circling back to the beginning of a journey. What is clear to me now is that the moment we were once in has now passed. The moment we are in at present time is much less clearly defined, much more indeterminate. It's a moment when, as David Scott writes, old horizons have collapsed or evaporated and new ones have not yet taken form. We are in a time, I think, of speculation and flux, vulnerability and risk, incoherence, but possibility, a politics without guarantees, as Stuart Hall, the great cultural theorist, once put it. And so take heed, we might not like what emerges on the other side of this moment. Racial progress has always been shadowed by disproportionate white backlash. We are very clearly in that backlash now. It manifests as the attack on critical race theory, the death threat sent to Black journalists in Canada, the use of woke as a disparaging slur, and the insistence that white professors have the right to use the N-word in their classrooms. It is the dilution that turned radical demands to rethink what we mean by justice into nothing more than EDI workshops. It is as much the benign neglect of the state as it is the collective shrug of Canadians everywhere about the predetermined failure of so many of the initiatives that we had hoped would change our workplaces, our education system, our social moorings, and our access to substantive democratic belonging. But nothing would have happened had Black people and our allies not taken to the streets. As the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so at what is the beginning, not the middle, and not the end of this most recent iteration of white backlash against racial justice, the very least we can do is remember and try to make sense of all that was and all that still might be. So truth be known, using my experiences as an entry point into a broader inquiry about race, Blackness, and belonging makes me deeply uncomfortable. If you've read my book, know that the amount of me that is in it is the result of a compromise between my editors and I. They always wanted more me, and I always wanted more footnotes. But this is not really a story about racism We don't write only of racism, of domination and despair. Instead, we write about life, impossible, improbable life. We live together here in the impossible, and we can struggle towards other impossible things with other impossible people. No one is illegal. No one is illegal on stolen land, land back. In Black studies, and therefore Black politics, storytelling is tradition, repetition is sacred, and writing is the process of turning bewilderment into awe. The discipline is one in which our methodological anchors are narratives, songs, grooves, tempos, ruptures, continuities, translations, ghosts, and hauntings, where the data we are most interested in is not easily or readily quantified or coded. Black studies is a discipline in which our citational practices are not just about showing what we know, but are rather about unknowingness. We cite those who came before us to trace the path we walked, to show what we didn't once know but now know better, and to demonstrate how it is that we came to know how much or little we think we might know now. Black studies as vocation isn't just interdisciplinary, but is instead undisciplinary and anti-disciplinary, in that we seek the knowledge through which we will achieve racial justice in this world, or we will remake it so those who follow can. This is an important point as universities seek to hire Black scholars into traditional disciplines. And know this, if you want us, but not the way our established discipline, which has been around for more than half a century, thinks about political and social phenomena, then what you want is not us. What you actually want is more of you. The truest thing, though, about travel and movement, as anyone who's ever gone anywhere implicitly knows, is how people change as they move. Our identities, our understandings of belonging and home are never fixed. They're never once and for all. And so the idea of a return is the stuff of fairy tales, going back to a place where we once were, but no longer are, and yet desire to be. It's a futility of the highest order. You can never really go home again, not because home changes, but because you do. Thank you.